Hi everyone. By now you've written the first two sections of your paper, the introduction and the method, but you have the results and discussion sections left. These you won't receive feedback on, so I'm making a video to help clarify some of the points of what you need to do. By this point, I hope you're really clear on the rationale behind your proposed study, what you expect to find, and what you plan to do. The last two sections you're going to write as if you've actually conducted the study, collected the data, and analyzed it, even though you don't actually have to do these things. You'll simply be writing what you would expect to find if you did. So for the results section, what I'll be going through is an example. You can take a look at this PDF of an example results section. When you're writing the results section, you do not need to make up specific numbers. Instead, you just need to describe what you would expect. However, because you don't have numbers, you do need to use your words to describe the effect. So you need to be fairly descriptive with your words, even though you're not putting in actual numbers. So first, you want to describe what types of scores you expect to find for each of your variables. So something along the lines of, most people scored themselves as low on aggression, but high on attractiveness. So describe kind of where people stand in terms of the constructs you're measuring. Next, you're going to describe how the variables are related to you. Related to each other. So in this example, it was an experiment. So if your study is experimental, you should describe the results for each group. So people who were in the experimental group looked like this. Those who were in the control group looked like that. So in this example, there was a significant difference in ratings of intelligence between photos of attractive versus unattractive. Photos of attractive individuals were rated as an average on intelligence. In contrast, photos of attractive individuals were rated as above average on intelligence. And then you want to discuss how the groups compare. So participants saw those who were more attractive as more intelligent. For a correlational study, instead of describing how groups compare, because in a correlational study you will not have groups, you should describe the strength and direction of the correlation. So something along the lines of, we found a large negative correlation between anxiety and test score. You should also describe what this correlation looks like. So for example, individuals with high anxiety had lower test scores, while those with lower anxiety had higher test scores. So we're describing how test scores look at both low and high anxiety. So once you've described kind of the relationships between your constructs, you will finally describe whether or not these findings were consistent with your hypotheses. They should be, because we're making this all up. You can see in this example, I said this is consistent with the hypothesis that attractiveness will positively influence the perception of intelligence. Because we haven't focused on specific analyses, the results in general will be the least detailed section of your paper, but I expect a clear explanation of your expected findings, even if it doesn't include all the details that we would see in a real publication. So I have posted examples of, I have posted this example on Moodle, and again, this is an example of an experimental design. If you proposed a correlational design, then you should be able to generalize and describe what I mentioned before. As a bonus, you can create a graph of your expected results. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on how to do this, so you need to figure it out on your own, which is why it's extra credit. The easiest way is probably either making up your numbers and putting them into Excel, or using some sort of drawing program. If you do this, you'll need to think about and look in your book for examples about what type of graph is most important to depict your findings. The graphs themselves, which in APA are called figures, go at the end of your paper after the references but before the appendix. However, you should make sure to refer to the graph in the text if you have it. So in the example, you can see I see figure 1. This would mean that I made up a graph that I've included at the end of my paper. Okay, the final section of your paper is the discussion. Often this seems like the easiest, but is actually the most challenging to write. The goal of the discussion section is really to think about the bigger picture and kind of take a step back. So first, you want to think about possible explanations for the relationships you found. So when you're thinking about that, you've already said, yes, I found a relationship between my variables. you want to think about, okay, if we take this out of the context of the experiment into the real world, is there really a link between your two variables? Or is it possible it has something to do with the way you tested it? The second thing that you're going to think about in the discussion is, what are the implications of these findings? So why does what you found matter? You want to extend beyond just the experiment you did and think about how it can be applied to the real world. In my example, I'm talking about the results and how they might influence bias on the job market or in education or in interviews. The third thing you want to discuss, and before I actually go into that, note that the first two questions, so possible explanations and implications for these findings, I've kind of combined, but then I made a separate section on limitations and future directions. So the third thing you want to discuss is the flaws of your study. So even though we made this up and it was hypothetical, and therefore you had kind of more leeway to do or more leeway than you would typically have, no study's perfect. So think about what was wrong with your study and what could have been done to make the study better. So that's your limitations and future directions. Kind of probably the first section will be what's wrong, and the future directions will be what's the next step to study. And then finally, you're going to have a conclusion section where you'll discuss why your topic is important to continue studying and possibly make a few suggestions for future research. Okay. So that's the basic content of what needs to go into your results and discussion sections. I have a lot of examples on Moodle, so I just want to make sure that you understand kind of what these are for. So the first two examples, so of course we have your grading rubric, which you should always go back and double check. You've already watched this and found your articles. So these two, the APA Guide and the APA Guide website, focus on how to cite your sources. So this should already be done unless you had errors. So these tell you how to do in-text citations and also your references. The next two examples are examples to help you with the formatting of your paper. This one in particular, I just want to make sure that everyone sees it's annotated, so it kind of describes what needs to go where. This is a different assignment than what you're doing, so the content is not necessarily the same, but the formatting should be. So you can see what a title page looks like, you can see what an abstract looks like. If you go all the way down to the end, and this is an empirical paper, so it has all of the general sections, you can see what a references page looks like. It also includes tables, which you probably won't have, but this is an example of what your figures might look like and how to format them. And then it also has an example of the appendix. I do talk about the appendix in the recording of the live lecture, so if you haven't watched that already, go back and watch that. But this is a useful guide for all of those formatting details. So that's this APA example paper. Again, the content is not the same as what you're doing, but the formatting should be. And then also I have this APA formatting help that's a PowerPoint that actually walks you through step-by-step in Microsoft Word how to do all the details of formatting. So these two sources are sources to help you with how to do APA format in terms of how do you space things, what goes on your title page, things like that. The next two example papers are actually parts of papers, the example method and example results and discussion sections. They are examples of this assignment. So the content is what you should focus on in these examples in terms of how to describe the things I'm asking you to describe. Now note that the formatting in these two examples is not necessarily finalized since they're only small parts of the paper. So for example, I don't think they have the correct headings. All of that is in these formatting examples. The last thing that I've added that I wanted to point out was this final paper checklist. When you think you're done, when you go to submit in a couple weeks, you go to submit your final paper, before you do so, I want you to go through and make sure you have all of these things. So in your final paper, you need a title page, You need an abstract. I've mentioned this before, but the abstract is the last thing you should write. It should be 150 to 250 words that summarizes every single section of your paper. And then you'll have the body of your paper, and note that in the body of your paper you don't have page breaks between the sections. So don't insert extra enters or returns between these sections. One comes after the other. You'll have your introduction, method, results, and discussion. You'll have your references, you'll have your appendix, and then you'll have your tables and figures. You probably won't have any tables, but if you do the figure for extra credit, it will go here. So you need to make sure you have all of these sections of your paper. And also go back and be sure to check your spelling and grammar, your APA formatting for the in-text citations and references. Again, you should have most of that done, but I may have noted where you need to make changes, so make sure you've done those. That you have your headers and running head in the right places. Look at those formatting examples for that. No direct quotes. Everything needs to be paraphrased and cited appropriately, and you should have 7 to 10 pages total. So this is a nice little checklist just before you get ready to submit to make sure you have everything. So I think that should cover everything you need to write your results and discussion section and finalize your paper. As usual, if you have questions, please feel free to contact me.